So we must do two things, two great things together to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself.
And then what would science say about the whole thing? How does science come to us? What does science say about it? Well, soul comes as soul sense. That's what science would see. As spiritual sense. And again, you see that I have also put spiritual understanding. That's a pretty good method, isn't it, to put everything in every column? But somehow spiritual understanding here, because meaning is relational, has also a touch of science, in that it belongs to that scientific faculty of soul sense. And we get the spiritual evidence of everything. That's the proof from soul's standpoint. And now if I follow the flow within my consciousness and the descent of the Holy Ghost, that is to say the reality of soul and all that soul is, coming and breaking in on me, within me, it may take me naturally and irresistibly to the realization of the absolute unreality of all that is not soul. Of what soul is not. It suddenly dawns on me. It's a great revelation of what soul is not. And this is what we call the D on the level of Christian Science. So just bear with me and flow with me and follow along, that we move now from the A to the D, and I'm just really following the natural flow within my own consciousness, because I begin to feel that soul is really working on anything and everything within me that isn't balanced, that is not absolutely coincident with the identity of soul. And what is it working on then? What else is it working on? As the Word. What does that look like as the Word? It's working on anything that is not the identity of soul, that is not identical with soul. Anything that is without identity, that isn't clear, that isn't distinct, that isn't clarified to us, any lack of identity, the truth, the whole truth of soul and soul's idea is working on that within my consciousness at every moment. It works on the false, mistaken sense of self. So you see that that one ego is working on the sense of self, of sin, the claim of the body. That claim of the body is that which is our identity and identifies us, which is a big claim, isn't it? Sure. Tremendous claim that the body identifies us, and that constitutes our identity and who we are. Soul is working on that, and it's going to free us from that and open us up to the infinite withinness of soul, take us out of the claim of being in a body. What else is the body? You know, that's a claim that includes many other claims. It is that claim of being in something. Actually, that has a touch of Christianity to it, but the body is the claim that we can be in something, very strong, that we're in something and limited and confined and restrained there, incapacitated. Whenever we're in something, we're really incapacitated. We can't move freely. We're incarcerated. All that really would misidentify us and would limit us in countless ways. So whatever those claims are, they are just from the standpoint of the Word being dealt with by the identity of soul. Soul is dealing with the self and with sense, with the claim that there could be a counterfeit at all, a counterfeit per se. So now you have to realize that the term counterfeit itself is a counterfeit of soul, okay? Just like illusion is a counterfeit of mind. What in spirit, the unrealities are a counterfeit of spirit. Counterfeit is a counterfeit of soul. So everyone's all right with that, huh? A counterfeit is the opposite of an identity, isn't it? So you can't have a counterfeit unless you have an identity. Yeah. So you can never have, for instance, a counterfeit $3 bill because there is no identity called a $3 bill. So those are the issues that seem to be worked out within us by soul at the point of the Word. And what would the Christ say about the issue, about those opposites of soul? That the belief, the claim of changeability then is being dealt with. That's the office of the Christ. Changeability, what are some of the sub-issues of changeability? How does changeability appear to us in D, in the really the essence of those counterfeits? It would be the belief of loss, right? That's a changeability. That we had something and then we lost it. Injury, you see, that we had a perfect state of identity, but something happened to it. It's been compromised in some way. It's been damaged. So the belief of damage, of impairment, of mutability, that something can be changed, the very claim that something could be changed from an identity to a disturbance in that identity, a change in that identity. This is impossible to soul. So that immutability of soul, that unchangeability of soul, is coming in at every moment to us, breaking in and addressing whatever seems to be changeable and that which shouldn't change and cannot truly change. Whatever seems to be of the nature of sin, you see, anything within us, in other words, that would deviate from the divine identity of God, soul. And finally, malpractice, which is the claim that there can be a sinful sense with the power to operate, with the power to do something. You see that sense of practicing, of working, of operating. This is all a Christ issue, and here it is a mal-practicing, a mal-operation going on. Soul is dealing with all of that. And from the standpoint of Christianity then, what are those counterfeits? The belief in limitations as such, of being in something, as we said, being in anything, the claim of sensations as an outcome. And then we have really a number of types of sensation, you see there. We have emotion, passion, pleasures, ecstasy, pain, suffering, and sorrow. It's rather like an ascending scale. It begins with emotion, passion, pleasures, and reaches some kind of a pinnacle at the point of ecstasy. And then we see that it is really downhill all the way with those sensations. And that is how it seems to start out, with emotions, and we feel that they are positive. We like our emotions. We want our emotions. We want to feel certain things. And attached with those emotions then are the passions that go with them that can be positive and that we think are positive and that are going to give us something and lead us to satisfaction and joy and happiness. And so we pursue those passions and the pleasure of the senses, material and physical senses. And they take us to a certain point. They take us to the point of ecstasy. And then we find that really coming out of it all is pain and suffering and sorrow. So soul is handling all of that, the whole gamut, the whole scale, so to say, of the sensations of the senses. Then soul is dealing with the claim of souls many, many souls. Do we believe in this? We say we don't, but we speak very often about the fact that he's a fine soul, a good soul, she's a good soul, God bless her soul, as though each one could have a soul of their own instead of the fact that there is but one soul and that we all have but that one soul. And then in science, perhaps you see that the counterfeits would be egotism. Again, we get an ism. Egotism, physical sense, testimony per se. You see, remember that wonderful article of Mrs. Eddy's Science versus the Senses? Science versus the senses. Here it is physical sense testimony per se, the evidence of the senses. Sense evidence versus the evidence of the science of soul. What the science of soul is telling us. And pantheism. Pantheism, you see, the belief in many gods is polytheism. Did we have that in spirit? Polytheism. Whereas pantheism is the belief that God is in everything. In the trees, in the flowers, in the mountains and rocks, in people, that there are many gods and that those gods dwell in all the things that we see and know. So that is the D. From the standpoint of the calculus of the D, really the great uncovering of that which is not soul, that which soul is not. So soul is working on that whole body of beliefs, that whole set of beliefs. And how is it ruling in the realm of this suppositional opposite? Soul rules in a very specific way, in a way that no other synonymous term is ruling. It's a way that is unique to soul. And we go to the B then, back to the B, and we see that from the standpoint of the word, soul shows us that it is the master. Soul says, I am the master. I give you the mastery. That it is leading us from sense to soul. You remember that from the compendiums. I think it's the very first entry, if I'm not mistaken, that we are led from sense to soul. Gosh, I can remember way, way back, starting that compendium study in the early 60s, and opening that soul compendium for the first time and seeing that entry, that idea, that soul leads us from sense to soul. How I loved that whole concept. So you can see that with the A, looking back at the A, we have that breaking in of the synonymous term. We have the breaking in from science and from divine science and absolute Christian science into and upon the consciousness of the level of Christian science. And we have those gifts of soul. You remember that in the A, they're the gifts they're unearned. It's that blessed state of receiving that which soul is and not having earned it or been able to earn it in any way. It's just a pure gift from science. But it's just the way, you see, that the Christ translation works. It isn't that we can earn it. It's the way the Christ translation works. It's the grace of soul to come and break in. And as it breaks in, we've seen it is dealing with something. It's dealing with the D. It's dealing with everything that isn't soul. And it's dealing with that claim, therefore, that there can be a lack of soul. It has a modus operandi that is dealing with that. So we really looked at what was breaking in on us, that's the A, and then what was being dealt with, the D, and now how it is being dealt with, that's the B. And then we'll see in C the outcome of that. And actually, what you have in the design of being is a hinting toward the operation of the two translations. I want to bring that out now, that it's what we see depicted in the design of being is hinting toward the operation of the two translations, the Christ translation. You have science, divine science, absolute Christian science, you might say as hinting toward the substance of the first translation, as that which is coming to us. Okay? That first translation is coming to us in the two translations. In the model of being, in the design of being, we see that science, divine science, absolute Christian science, is coming to us, is breaking in on us. What is that first translation? What do we mean? It's the true understanding which God has of himself. That's what science, divine science, absolute Christian science, in a very great sense, is giving us the true understanding which God has of himself. The true analysis, really, we might say. We get the true analysis of what God being is. And we see that in the second translation, we have that breaking in as uncovering the nothingness of what God is not. So in terms of soul, we could see that science, divine science, and absolute Christian science bring us the true understanding of soul, how soul knows itself, the true analysis of soul, that this is breaking in on the human condition. What happens as that happens? We get what we see in the second translation. So we have, first of all, an uncovering. You see that the true analysis always brings an uncovering. And what is that uncovering? The uncovering as nothing of that which is not soul. What is not real, you see. You know that in the second translation, that first degree, which is what we're talking about, that first degree, is depicted as unreality. So that which is uncovered is the unreality of that which is not soul. Okay? And you know that in what we call the second translation, the translation of mortal mind, that you have the first degree, the second degree, and the third degree. And the first degree is, as we said, termed unreality, as though to say that when you come out from God, and that's what the first translation does, it begins with God, it comes out from God, that the result in the second translation is that that which is not God is revealed. It's revealed to you what soul is not. or it is not soul. So that revelation comes to us as the overwhelming sense, oh, this is not real. This is not God. This is not soul. So instead of feeling, oh, we have something suddenly that is so tremendous and has its own reality, it has its own identity, this first degree is really something we have to fight against, to overcome. It's another power, it's another intelligence that must be dealt with. That's not what the two translations show at all. You see, they show that all that which comprises the first degree revealed by the understanding of God is unreal. Is unreal. Can we grasp that? That's the thing. Can we grasp it? Because this has everything to do with the equipolence of God. With the equipolence of God. And those two translations follow the very section in which Mrs. Eddy explains her great discovery, her own discovery of the fact of what she calls the awful unreality of evil. That she discovered the awe-filling unreality of evil. And that's exactly what is depicted in the two translations. That is exactly what is being depicted in the design of being. So she was filled with the awe, before the unreality of evil, the nothingness of evil. Can you hear it? Instead of being filled with awe before evil, it's before the unreality of evil. Mm-hmm. This is the true meaning of the first degree. You see, when it's understood within the whole context of the Christ translation. And so as we come out from science, divine science, absolute Christian science, what breaks in on us is a realization here in soul of what soul is not. This is absolutely divinely automatic, you might as well say. It's the effect of God's own understanding of himself on us. The effect on my understanding, you see. That I say, oh, then soul is not this and this and this. It isn't self. It isn't sense. It isn't being in the body. It isn't any of those things that have seemed to be real. Those are unreal. So we have with the D, really on the level of Christian Science, with the D, an instance of the first degree, depravity being shown to be unreal in the light of soul here. So what has been happening is really the B. What's been going on is the B. That everything in science, divine science, absolute Christian science, is mastering that which seems to be a separate reality of not soul, you see. That there could be a separate reality called not soul. And from then those higher levels comes the ability to master it, to lead the warfare, to lead us from sense to soul. And the Christ would say in that be then what? How do I see that? It's a rebuking. Soul rebukes. It rebukes those counterfeits. It reverses. Can you hear the Christ? Reverses them, rejects them. To rebuke is to reject. It begins to reform, to transform, to restore, to bring everything back to the identity again. Everything that has been set forth in science divine science and absolute Christian science, and may seem to have been lost, may appear to the senses to have been lost, all is brought back to the identity again within our very own understanding. And from the standpoint of Christianity, what is that? It's an exchanging then of the objects of sense for the ideas of soul. That's the outcome. The objects of sense are exchanged for the ideas of soul. And the outcome is a bringing forth of the resurrection of soul, the reappearance of soul. Remember, we had the sense of ideas ever appearing. Now you see further down in the whole translation through the levels of the design of being, now we come to a standpoint where the claim that appearing has been erased or could ever disappear or be interrupted in any way or stopped in any way. Now we see soul takes care of that. Soul is working. It knows exactly what to do to bring about the reappearance of the idea, again, within our own conscious understanding. So you see now that sense that ideas are ever appearing comes to us in the most practical way, the way that we need it. So the representation of soul represents itself in the face of the claim that the identity has been lost, that the identity has been forfeited or hidden, or that it is missing. There's a reappearing again. And then finally, from the standpoint of science, what does science say in the be? Science says, yes, I know what is going on. All that is going on is a retranslation process. I, soul, am regulating everything. The rule of soul is regulating and ruling over the claim that there is any counterfeit whatsoever of soul. So we have a beautiful sense of the operation of that calculus ever working on the level of that claim of there being anything else but soul going on, and how that claim is dealt with. So we come to the C, and we have the outcome of that process in B, and that outcome is what we know from the two translations, the Christ translation, the second degree. It can be analogous with or equated in a certain degree with the second degree. It's something higher, better, holier, a higher humanity, you see, which soul is bringing out now. And it is that which is more soul-like within our own being. It's being raised up within us, all that is like soul. And I begin to identify, therefore, correctly about everything as I am being changed. All right, so we are at the point of C, and it's that a very just beautiful place to be, where we are being changed by soul. We are being changed into the likeness of soul. And the calculus is governing that. The calculus is forming that and shaping that according to the calculus. So we get at first, the very first breaking in of that as the Word. And it's where we begin to see that we identify, that we want to identify everything correctly. We have the desire to identify everything correctly. Where I re-identify everything, I rename everything. See, all that's going on within my consciousness, that the way that I used to identify things, how I saw them, how I've, named them, what I named them. Think about Adam, how They brought all the animals to Adam, and he named them. And so every experience that comes to us, somehow we name it, we identify it, we give it a certain identity and character that we think it has. And soul says, I want you to re-identify everything out from soul, out from me. So we begin to re-identify everything in our experience and to rename it. And we begin to become more balanced in our experience, in our life. Because I think the moment you can identify properly and identify with the science of soul, with the ability of soul, with the nature of soul within you, that you feel a sense of balance coming into your life. So from the standpoint of the Christ, you see, we can trace that identity right down from the Christ and see that it is being reflected within our higher nature, that now we are experiencing and feeling that touch of those Christ characteristics within ourselves, where we have the quality of self-abnegation. What is self-abnegation? It's laying down, putting down, sacrificing the self, subjecting the self, you see, dealing with all those self issues, those ego issues, becoming unselfed, selfless. Actually, you see, to be unselfed is a little bit more than being selfless. It is to have no self at all, not just to subordinate the self and try to make it behave, and try to keep it in its place. We've all tried those things, and they are insufficient really before the power of soul, the regulating power of soul to render the self, the human, material, mortal self, nothing before the true ego of us, the one ego. So it is not just to subordinate the self, but not to have a self-sense at all. And it's there that we see that this is the meekness, really, of the third beatitude. You know that third beatitude, what is it? Would you recall? I like to turn the tables every once in a while. I just want to make sure you're listening. And what is that third beatitude? Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit what? The earth. What earth is that? The dry land of soul, huh? Blessed are we when we put down the self, we lay off the self, when we have the meekness, you see, to be willing to give that up, because the reward is great, great, great. We get really soul itself. We get the dry land of the third day. We inherit the earth, the whole solidity, the whole definiteness, the whole crystallizing of the spiritual realm. That's what we get when the self goes out. Isn't that terrific? And so that meekness is also the humility of soul. And finally, the sincerity of soul. To be sincere. Yes, I was just pausing for a moment over that idea of being sincere and why I had to put that in the Christ. You see, I have it here because it reminds me and makes me feel very much about that coincidence that the Christ is creating within us. To be sincere gives me a feeling of that coincidence, of that state of being where there is no discrepancy, you see, between what we say and what we are, what we do. They're all coincident. That's the office of the Christ to render that so. So they are identical, you see, at the deep nature, at the deep structure. That's sincerity. That we say something and we actually mean what we say. We carry it out through our actions. That, I think, is the sincerity of soul. And it has also another touch to it. To be sincere is to somehow to adhere to the rule of soul. If we think of that rule of soul as always going back and starting with mind, beginning with mind, and then in spirit to put first things first, to have only one God, to be true really to mind and spirit, this is the rule of soul. And when we follow that rule, we're sincere. This is sincerity. Yes, okay, well, let's just stop here for a moment.